asleep beneath a silver moon, and a single path appears, faint as a dream, leading toward the lake of quiet stars. There, time moves differently. The air carries the scent of dew and meadow herbs, and the water shimmers with a light not entirely its own. They say the stars drift down to rest upon its surface, glowing like tiny candles that remember what peace feels like. Our story begins with a wanderer named Cael, a soul who walks not for distance, but for meaning. On this night, he feels a quiet pull calling him toward the lake, not with words, but with stillness. And so, lantern in hand, he steps into the moonlit fields, guided only by the whisper of grass and the hum of the night. Breathe slowly now. Let your thoughts settle like mist over the hills. As the story unfolds, you may find yourself walking beside him, feeling the same soft pull, hearing the same music of silence. Welcome to the lake of quiet stars, where the night listens back. The night had settled softly over the valley, like a blanket woven from dusk and memory. A cool breath of wind wandered between silver reeds, carrying the scent of meadow herbs and dew. Far beyond the sleepy village, where the sky arched wide and clear, a secret path wound toward a quiet lake, one known only to those who listened carefully to the world when it whispered. There, tucked between gentle hills and low clouds, the lake of quiet stars shimmered. It was said that on nights when the moon hung low enough to touch the surface, the stars would drift down to rest upon the water, trembling like tiny candles. The people of the valley rarely visited after sunset, preferring firesides and stories to moonlit paths, but the lake was never lonely. It had its own company, soft winds, slow ripples, and dreams that wandered in from far away. In a small cottage at the edge of the nearest meadow lived a young traveler named Cael. He wasn't a traveler in the grand sense. His adventures were more like long, thoughtful walks, sometimes a climb up the ridge, sometimes a journey down a dirt path that disappeared among ancient oaks. He had an old pack, a small lantern, and a mind full of questions that had no need for answers. That evening, Cael stood by the window, watching the slow rise of the moon. The world outside looked calm, wrapped in shades of blue and silver. The hum of crickets blended with the soft rustle of grasses. Somewhere nearby, an owl sent out a thoughtful note into the cool air. Cael smiled faintly. He had been feeling the pull of the lake for days now, a quiet invitation that brushed through his thoughts whenever the night grew still. There were stories, of course, stories about the stars that sank into the water and slept there until dawn, about voices in the mist that told forgotten dreams. He didn't truly believe such things, but then again, he didn't disbelieve them either. Some things, he thought, were meant simply to be felt. He packed a blanket, a flask of tea, and his small wooden flute that had belonged to his grandmother. The road to the lake wasn't long, but it wound upward into gentle hills, and Cael liked to take his time. Each step he decided would be part of the story the night was telling. The world beyond his door was bathed in moonlight. The path stretched ahead like a ribbon laid carefully across dark velvet fields. When he walked, the grass whispered against his boots, and now and then a small spark of firefly light drifted past his sleeve. The air was alive with tiny movements, the sigh of leaves, the distant creak of a branch, the soft murmuring hush of the earth turning beneath him. After a while, he found himself humming softly, no melody in particular, just a tune that matched the rhythm of his steps. It seemed to him that the hills were listening. Every rise and dip of the path carried the song away, letting it dissolve into the silver light. As he walked, he thought of the stories his grandmother used to tell. She'd said the lake had once been a valley sky, turned upside down by a dreamer's wish. The stars that slept there were not real stars, but pieces of memory, moments of peace from every soul that had ever needed rest. When a person sat beside the water, she told him, they might see a reflection of their calmest self, gazing back. Cael smiled at the thought. He paused for a moment beneath a willow, laying a hand against its cool bark. The tree swayed in rhythm with the night breeze, and from its branches came a rain of soft, whispering leaves. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply until the stillness drenched him completely. When he opened them again, the lake lay just ahead. It was more beautiful than any story could have promised. The water stretched wide, perfectly still except for the faintest ripples where silver minnows turned beneath the surface. Overhead, the moon hung low, pearl white, serene. And yes, the stars did seem to shimmer on the water's skin, floating like tiny lanterns adrift in a dream. Cael walked to the edge and knelt, dipping his fingers into the cool shallows. The water was soft, smoother than silk. It carried no chill, only a quiet pulse of warmth that seemed to come from within itself. He felt as though the lake recognized him, not his name or his past, but something smaller and truer, a quiet heart, wandering and open. He spread his blanket upon the grass and settled down, lighting his small lantern. Its glow mingled with the moonlight, turning the air golden where it met the silver reflection. He poured a cup of tea, the steam curling like pale ribbons, and let the calm of the lake seep into him. The smell of the tea mingled with the scent of night-blooming flowers, faint as a sigh. Somewhere on the far shore, a night bird called. Then silence again, thick but gentle, like a sleeping sea. Time floated loosely around Cael as he watched the water. Little by little, he felt himself unwind. Thoughts that had been tight coils in his chest began to loosen, stretching out into the moonlight. He took slow breaths, matching them to the steady lap of the water against the shore. From the distance came a faint glimmer, a light moving across the far end of the lake. At first, he thought it was just a reflection of a star sliding along a ripple, but then it grew clearer, moving closer with a soft rhythm like oars in water. A small boat appeared, carved from pale gently. At its stern stood a tall figure wrapped in layers of soft gray cloth, a wide hood drawn over their head. The boat glided as though carried by thought rather than current. Cael felt no fear, only curiosity and a deep, dreamy calm. When the boat reached the shore, the figure dipped an oar and brought it to rest beside him. "Good evening," Cael said softly, as though not to disturb the quiet. The figure lifted their head, and he glimpsed a face both young and ageless, lit by the reflection of the lantern. "Good evening," the stranger replied, their voice low and melodic, blending with the night air. "You've come to watch the stars, haven't you?" "Yes," Cael said, smiling faintly. "And perhaps to listen," the stranger nodded. "Then listen well. The lake speaks only in calm breath and patient hearts." The stranger sat beside him on the grass, folding their hands neatly in their lap. They looked out upon the lake, and for a long while neither spoke. The silence between them was companionable, a shared stillness that seemed to stretch outward and touch the farthest stars. After some time, the stranger said, "Few come here without reason. Some seek peace, some search for what they have lost. Others just follow the pull of the quiet. Which are you, traveler?" Cael considered. "I'm not sure," he said at last. "Perhaps I came because the world felt too loud for a while. I wanted to remember what stillness sounds like." The stranger smiled gently. "Then you've come to the right place. The lake remembers stillness even when the sky forgets." They reached down, touching the surface lightly with one fingertip. A ring of light spread outward, shimmering like a halo. "Each ripple is a story the stars left behind," they said. "Sometimes, if you listen deeply enough, you'll hear them telling themselves again." Cael closed his eyes and listened. At first, there was only the usual chorus of the night, the faint hum of insects, the breathing of the wind. But gradually he began to notice something beneath it all. A low, rhythmic sound, like a distant heartbeat. Then faint whispers, almost too soft to recognize as words. Tones that rose and fell like sighs. He couldn't make out what they said, but the feeling of them was tender and weightless, like the half-remembered comfort of a lullaby. When he opened his eyes again, a small glow hovered over the lake, just beyond the reeds. It was not from the stars above, nor from his companion's lantern. It was something else, something alive. Slowly, the glow shaped itself into a cluster of lights, drifting together like petals on a stream. Within the shifting halo, faint figures could be seen, tiny, delicate beings made of light itself. They danced just above the water, their motions slow and deliberate, as though moving to a music only they could hear. Cael watched, entranced. "The star sleepers," whispered the stranger beside him. "They gather here when the world grows quiet enough. They are the dreams of those who rest, finding their way back home." The little beings spiraled upward, their trails of light weaving patterns through the air. For a moment, the entire lake glowed faintly, every ripple catching the movement, every star above leaning closer to see. Then, one by one, the lights drifted down again, sinking softly into the surface until only ripples remained. Cael's heart felt light. It wasn't excitement, something more peaceful than that. It was as though each breath he took was unfolding into space around him, gently expanding and dissolving into the night. "Do they always come?" he asked quietly. The strangers shook their head. "Only when someone listens, truly listens. You've given the night your attention, and so it gives something back." Cael bowed his head slightly, as if in gratitude. "And who are you?" he asked after a pause. The stranger smiled. "A keeper of still things," they said simply. "I help the lake remember what it is. Sometimes I guide wanderers who find their way here, just as you did." They both watched the water in silence again. The moon had climbed higher now, scattering ripples of light across the surface. The night air was cool, but not cold. It settled around them with the softness of a blanket freshly folded. Cael took out his little flute and turned it over in his hands. "Would it disturb the stars," he asked, "if I played a little?" "Not at all," said the keeper. "They might even join you." So Cael raised the flute and began to play, a slow, gentle melody that wound through the air like a drifting wisp of smoke. The notes were tender, sometimes almost too faint to be heard, but the lake heard them all. The sound rippled outward across the water, and each tone seemed to find its reflection, doubling softly back toward him. The keeper closed their eyes, listening, and after a while, Cael could swear the light of the stars grew warmer, as though smiling down at the song. He played until the wind changed, only slightly, a shift in the air that carried the smell of rain far away. Then he lowered the flute, resting it upon his knee. The keeper opened their eyes and studied him quietly. "You have the sound of rest in your music," they said. "Few do. Most carry the sound of motion, of yearning, of unfinished stories. But your notes end where they began. That is a gift." Cael looked down at the flute. "It was my grandmother's," he murmured. "She used to say it could make flowers grow straighter if you played it kindly enough." The keeper smiled faintly. "Kindness has power. Even the stars listen to it." The two spoke little after that. The hours slipped by unnoticed, filled with the slow music of the night. The lake seemed endless, not in size, but in depth of quiet. Every sound came softly, every movement unhurried. Cael lay back upon his blanket, gazing upward. The stars blinked lazily, their light drifting in and out of the thin clouds. He felt small, but not in a way that frightened him, more like being held gently in a vast hand. Everything around him, the hills, the lake, the stranger, the stars, felt connected, breathing together in one long, wordless sigh. He didn't know if he slept or merely drifted between waking and dream, but soon he felt warmth against his cheek, the faint promise of dawn. his eyes again, the sky had begun to fade from blue to rose. Mist hovered over the lake, curling like fine silk ribbon. The keeper stood nearby, the soft light of morning tracing the folds of their robe. Morning comes softly here, they said. It never hurries. It knows the night must exhale before the day can breathe. Cael smiled. I feel lighter, he admitted, as though I left something behind. Perhaps you did, the keeper replied. The lake collects burdens as quietly as it collects stars. You gave yours away without noticing. He thought of the whispers he had heard beneath the water, the feeling of release in every note he had played. Perhaps his worries had been among those ripples, carried out into the calm until they became part of it. The keeper turned toward their boat. I will take you across, they said. The path that leaves from the eastern shore will lead you home. You'll find it feels different now, though nothing has changed. Cael folded his blanket, tucked the flute back into his pack, and followed them into the boat. The wood rocked gently beneath their weight. The lake lay still as glass. Only the soft dip of the oar disturbed its surface. As they glided through the mist, the reflections of clouds above mingled with those below, and for a moment it was impossible to tell where sky ended and water began. The world seemed doubled, an endless cradle of light and hush. Halfway across, the keeper paused. Will you remember what the lake told you? They asked. I think so, said Cael. It told me that stillness isn't empty, just waiting. That quiet holds its own kind of music. The keeper nodded approvingly. Then his lesson is safe with you. Carry it gently. The loud world needs soft voices. Cael bowed his head, touched by the words. The boat glided onward, and soon it reached the far side, where the reeds grew tall and gold in the early light. He stepped out onto the soft earth. The keeper smiled once more. When the stars call again, you'll know the way back. And before Cael could reply, the mist drew around the boat, and it was gone. Nothing left but a slow widening ripple on the calm surface. Cael stood for a moment, breathing in the scent of dawn. The path ahead wound between dew-silvered grasses, leading toward the first thickets of morning birds. He turned once to look back at the lake. It lay still and pale beneath the rising sun, perfectly ordinary in daylight, yet he knew it was never truly ordinary. Beneath that calm expanse, the dreams of the stars still rested, deep and undisturbed. He began his walk home. The world around him felt new somehow, though he recognized every familiar bend and rise. Each sound seemed softer, more meaningful. The rustle of a sparrow, the burble of a distant creek, even the faint creak of his old leather strap. He realized that what the keeper had said was true. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. As he walked, he took out his flute and played once more. The tune was different this time. Not a lullaby, but a morning song, light and flowing like sunlight on ripples. The air shimmered faintly as though listening, When he reached his cottage, he left the window open to let the day breeze wander through. He set his pack aside and poured himself another cup of tea. The steam rose lazily, carrying faint reflections of the lake in its curls. He sat quietly, sipping, feeling the warmth move through him like the lake's calm made liquid. That night, when darkness returned and the fireflies began their quiet dance in the meadow, Cael found himself listening again. He didn't need to visit the lake to hear it anymore. Its sound now lived within him. When he closed his eyes, he could still sense the rhythm of the oar, the shimmer of distant whispers underwater, the kindness in the keeper's voice. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that calm is not something one finds, but something one remembers. And so, gently, he smiled to himself and whispered a soft good night to the stars, to the stillness, to the lake waiting patiently beyond the hills. As he drifted toward sleep, something subtle stirred in the air, a faint echo of the flute's melody, twining with the hush of the evening. It folded him into its arms, carrying him through dreams that glowed faintly with silver light. Far away, at the lake of quiet stars, a single ripple formed, spreading outward in a perfect circle. The stars above leaned closer, listening as the night whispered another story into being. Sometimes, on certain nights when the world is still, travelers passing through the valley claim to hear a soft music coming from the hills. No words, no clear melody, just a sound like the sigh of distant waters, the hum of a peaceful wind. They say if you follow it, you might find your way to the lake. The path will only appear if your heart is calm enough to see it. And when you arrive, the stars will be waiting, drifting upon the surface as though time itself has slowed to listen. If you stay long enough and truly listen, the lake might reflect something back to you. Not your face, perhaps, but your quietest self, the one that dreams in silence and sleeps beside the stars. And when you leave, you'll carry that stillness with you, gentle, steady, and endless as breath. And so, as dawn brushed the horizon with rose and gold, Cael left the lake behind, lighter than when he arrived. The keeper's boat drifted back into the mist, and the ripples faded, but the calm remained, carried within him like a secret melody. The lake of quiet stars had shown him what stillness truly means, that silence is not empty, it is full of listening, that calm is not found, it is remembered. Now as you drift towards your own rest, imagine that same lake waiting somewhere in the folds of your mind. Its waters are smooth and patient, reflecting not your face, but your quietest self, the part of you that knows peace. Close your eyes. Feel the breath of the night, the shimmer of distant stars.